So then we went into aggressive negotiations.
Aggressive negotiations? What's that?
Negotiations with a lightsaber.
Oh.
If Master Obi-Wan caught me doing this, he'd be very grumpy. A young and poor creator with a vision works away for years at their personal passion project. This vision isn't particularly groundbreaking in terms of new storytelling techniques. In fact, it draws on incredibly popular tropes and old story archetypes in the framing of its narrative that have been used plenty of times before. They just happen to do it in a slightly new context. This context, it turns out, is a massive hit, and it rakes them in billions of dollars, leading to a film series, books, and toy lines. This young and poor creator is now older and richer. Years later, the studio realizes that they're not quite done with that intellectual property, and they want the creator to make more stuff in this awesome universe. They want them to make a prequel. This is the story of both J.K. Rowling, author of the 500 million copies sold Harry Potter series, and author of the new Fantastic Beasts Crimes of Grindelwald prequel film, and of George Lucas, creator of the original Star Wars trilogy, and overlord of the prequel series, which is widely panned by some people. The thing is that prequels have a frequent problem of being bad. But why? Now, this doesn't mean that all prequels are bad. For example, Prometheus? It was good, I think. It has a 73% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, but Alien Covenant has 66%, so... It also doesn't mean that any prequel that you could write will be bad by nature of it being a prequel. But there is something about prequels that makes them hard to do well.
Les noms magiques.
The what? Did he just say?
Les noms magiques.
In our investigation, we will be using the Star Wars prequels and the Crimes of Grindelwald as case studies. Now, let's talk 1940s post-structuralist literary theory! And other stuff for people who don't like that. Chapter 1. The author is dead, and we killed him.
It's over, non-magique. I have the high Grindelwald. You underestimate my power. Don't try it. Ah!
Stories can be badly written, badly cast, badly acted, badly directed, badly edited, badly composed, badly animated, but these are all problems that any type of story can face, not specifically prequels. Prequels need to have a relationship with the original work to be prequels, but they often have a particular type of relationship that causes problems. This being that they take an event that is referenced in the original work that the audience is given very few facts about, and they extrapolate a story out of it, turning a mysterious event into a non-mysterious one. In Star Wars, we know that the Jedi fell, but we don't know how. In Harry Potter, we hear about Dumbledore and Grindelwald's relationship, but we don't know what happened or how Grindelwald rose to power. But why does this relationship with the original work cause problems? Well, I think I'll let my English friend Caspar Buckworthington tell you a little bit more about that. Oh. Hello there. My name's Casper, but you can call me anything you want. I see my friend sent you my way for some literary wisdom. Care to join me by the fire? It's lovely and warm. It's rather beautiful. A red? I do love a red. In 1946, W.K. Wimsatt and M.C. Beardsley published their essay, The Intentional Fallacy, writing, "A poem can only be through its meaning, since its medium is words, yet it is, simply is, in the sense that we have no excuse for inquiring as to what part is intended or meant. Critical inquiries are not settled by consulting the oracle." This essay is an early writing in what would become known as Death of the Author, a literary theory brought together by Roland Barthes in the 1960s. What this means, as an erudite English philosopher such as myself would know, is not that we literally kill the author, such barbarism, no, but that what matters is the text itself, the experience of it, and what the reader gets out of it, not what the author intended in writing it. In this theory, whether or not you subscribe to it, authorial intent takes a backseat to the text itself. You have to savor the taste. That the merits of the text are to be found in the experience of the reader, rather than in the intention of the author, consulting the oracle, as they so whimsically put it. If the author did not put it in the text, then it is not part of the text, or it was not effectively communicated. Oh, you're still here. You're wondering how this connects to prequels. Do I have to spell it out for you? Beg me. There is one particular scene in the original 1973 Star Wars film that has created one of the series' longest-standing controversies.
Oscar. Yes, I bet you have.
Han Solo is sitting in the cantina with the bounty hunter Greedo when things get tense between them, though it could be said that both characters shoot at one another at the same time because of the composition of the scene, a mix of camera angles, editing and timing and lighting. It's ambiguous as to who shot first. You could legitimately think that Greedo shot first and that Han Solo shot back in self-defense, but a majority, or at least a large part of the Star Wars following, interpreted the scene as Han shooting first. This interpretation became quite important to them. They felt that this made him a more morally grey character, making his eventual change into a hero throughout the series even more meaningful. This was their interpretation of the film, and it helped them connect with the story. That was until...
I'm not dead. You can't kill me. I'm George Lucas.
In 1997, George Lucas came out with a revised version of A New Hope that clearly shows Greedo shooting Han first. In 2004, Lucas stated that the controversy over who shot first, Greedo or Han Solo, in episode 4, what I did was try to clean up the confusion, but obviously it upset people because they wanted Solo to be a cold-blooded killer, but he actually isn't. Like a zombie breaking the earth and awaking from its grave, the author is not dead. And the question became, which of these two interpretations is true? Death of the Author theory suggests that, actually, I will let Casper Buckworthington take this side of things again. Oh. I didn't see you there. You came back. I can understand why you might tonight. You wanted some more literary theory. Well, those who subscribe to Wimsatt's and Beardsley's Death of the Author theory would say that both the interpretation of Han as a morally grey hero shooting first and Lucas's interpretation of him as a good man acting in self-defense are equally legitimate. The fact that Lucas is the author does not make his interpretation any more valid. In fact, some would argue that George Lucas dictating to the audience which interpretation they should have of that scene is an act of literary and directorial despotism, grounded only in a vigilance of selfishness, that all minds should be of his own about his work. If you don't mind, I have some business to attend to. Alright then, Dr. Casper. Here we have a creator taking an ambiguous moment from the original work and specifying exactly what happened as pertains to their interpretation of the story. But that's kind of the problem. It's in these moments of ambiguity and interpretation that the reader truly engages with the work on a personal level. Death of the author theory highlights two problems here. Firstly, taking the dictations of the author as the real interpretation of the text means that readers aren't really engaging with the text so much as they are engaging with the author themselves. Secondly, this approach attempts to invalidate interpretations of the text that help people connect with the story on a deeper level, and it's the experience of a reader that matters in a work. Focusing too much on authorial intent means that the text itself doesn't stand on its own. And if you haven't guessed it already, prequels have a tendency to do this exact same thing. In particular, it's what Crimes of Grindelwald and the Star Wars prequels did. They took an ambiguous element of the original work, and they used a prequel to dictate the true interpretation of it. And of course, I can tell you, because my interpretation is just as valid, that this scene is a masterful work of art. Anakin taking the pear from Padme is a metaphor for him taking Padme herself, and the fact that she consumes part of the pear is a metaphor for their eventual, inevitable, oncoming doom, that they would be consumed by their love, metaphorically and physically. Chapter 2. Expectation is the root of all heartache. While Fantastic Beasts might centre around Newt Scamander, J.K. Rowling is still taking an ambiguous story element from the original work and telling us the real story, the story of Grindelwald and Dumbledore, which we only get referenced a few times in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. The boys took to each other at once. I'd sometimes hear an owl tapping at Gellert's bedroom window, delivering a letter from Albus. An idea would have struck him, and he had to let Gellert know immediately. However, there can be no doubt that Dumbledore delayed for some 5 years of turmoil, fatalities, and disappearances his attack upon Gellert Grindelwald. Was it lingering affection for the man? It turned out in 2007 that readers really engaged with this particular part of the text with their own interpretations. Many interpreted the story as Dumbledore being gay and his romantic attachment to Grindelwald blinding him to the truth for years, with Grindelwald using his affection against him for his own means, while others read it as a strong, genuine, close, but platonic relationship between two boys that ended in tragedy. Readers really engaged with the ambiguity of the text. With these personal and communal interpretations developing in the community, everyone has different expectations, not just about how the story might be told, like with a sequel, but how the story should be told. Because this is the text to them. It's seeing what has already been laid down on the page. I don't think that Death of the Author theory can give us precise answers by itself, but I do think it's a useful lens through which we can examine the problems that arise with prequels. The first one being this: no prequel story written by the author will ever measure up to all of these different subjective interpretations of the text, and if the story does reflect audience expectations, then it's often seen as fan service. Crimes of Grindelwald did touch on Dumbledore's story, but it didn't approach his sexuality explicitly, much to the disappointment of many fans, some even feeling that this was the wrong way to tell the story. And even worse, the reveal at the end that Dumbledore and Grindelwald have a blood pact that magically prevents them from fighting means that the reason that Dumbledore doesn't face down against Grindelwald isn't because of deep-seated emotional turmoil, heartbreak, and attachment, but because of a magical gimmick. That, narratively speaking, is the biggest obstacle. Like with Han Shot First, telling the story invalidates interpretations of the original text that meant that people connected with it more personally. Death of the Author theory would say that this actually undermines the original text, and that in effect we aren't engaging with the text, but with the author herself, J.K. Rowling, Effectively, Crimes of Grindelwald is just her stating her interpretation of the story in a more complex medium, a prequel. In the case of Star Wars, George Lucas took the fall of the Jedi and the rise of Vader as that ambiguous event referenced only a few times in the original work.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
When I left you, I was but the learner. Now I am the master.
No. I am your father.
Like with Dumbledore and Grindelwald, viewers really engaged with the backstory of this villain, with everyone developing their own subjective sense of the story that preceded A New Hope. The result was that it isn't purely George Lucas's work that makes Vader one of the most memorable villains of all time, but the mythos that the community built around him. Fans saw the rivalry between Obi-Wan and Darth Vader as one arising out of deep-seated and personal betrayal, that Vader would turn to the dark side with a complex and believable fall of emotional turmoil, only to find out in the prequels that it was because he was gullible and horny.
The thought of not being with you, I can't breathe.
Did you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
How does this guy know so much about the Sith? Nah, it's nothing. Padme. Prequels often suffer because they are written so that people view them through the lens of their experience of the original work. Prequels are often, as in the case of Star Wars and the Crimes of Grindelwald, an exercise in authorial intent, clarifying an ambiguity in the original story and casting aside subjective interpretation and experience of the original work. Death of the Author theory recognizes that those experiences matter, and it is because they matter that people don't enjoy prequels as much. The stories don't necessarily stand on their own, but simply dictate how you should be experiencing the original story, how you should read Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, or how you should watch A New Hope. Whereas a sequel usually builds on your experience and cannot easily affect how you see the characters or story in the original work, prequels have a tendency to retroactively alter your personal experience. And this leads us on to the second problem that prequels face: dependency on the original work. Chapter 3. Such a dependency of thing on thing. What does it mean for a story to be too dependent? Prequels need to have some kind of relationship with their original work, but unlike with sequels where an author can add anything they wish to the story, a prequel demands that they work within the already established original story to a degree. We've already discussed how this risks altering and invalidating the experience of the original work, but this setup also leaves the author with the challenge of simultaneously writing a story that complements the original work and writing a story that stands on its own. This is a difficult challenge, and it is not one that many prequels have succeeded in. And, of course, it's understandable why executive producers and our glorious corporate overlords would want to draw on connections to the original work, because you gotta get that money. And if readers and audiences see that connection, then they're more likely to pay to read the book or see the film. This is why Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, was advertised not so much as its own story, but as the beginning of the original story. That this is where Darth Vader, you know that villain that you love so much, this is where his story begins. It's also why half of the Crimes of Grindelwald trailer is dedicated to showing us Dumbledore and Hogwarts, places and people that we love and are attached to, even though they feature very little in the film overall. Now, while a writer does need to make clear how these two stories are connected, it can be tempting to rely on this too much and you end up making stilted and awkward references to the original work. So you enjoying it?
Yeah, it's,
Remember how Obi-Wan wore those robes in A New Hope?
yeah, I remember.
Now they're the Jedi uniform.
Oh, just gonna...
Oh, and you know how you love the Death Star? Well, now you can see that they had the plans for the Death Star back in Attack of the Clones. Oh, and you know Boba Fett? Now he's got a tragic backstory. Oh, and you know how much you love the Force? Well, I'm gonna give you so much Force with all these midi-chlorians. You're gonna love that. Oh, and C-3PO? Gonna give you a whole backstory for him as well. Aren't you gonna love that?
Sure, it's a good story.
A good story? Don't you love the story? It has all the things that you loved, but more and bigger and better. Why don't you love it? Why don't you love me, Mom? I mean, why don't you love this prequel? I mean...
But these references don't necessarily complement the original work, and they certainly don't help the prequel stand on its own as a story. Instead, the prequel ends up compromising its storytelling and narrative to make references to the original work to draw people in because it's easier, and you end up answering questions that people didn't really even want to know the answers to. And this might work as a marketing strategy, but it doesn't make for a satisfying prequel experience. Most of the big dramatic scenes in the Star Wars prequels and Crimes of Grindelwald will resonate with you if you're familiar with the original story, rather than these scenes standing out on their own. They become dependent on the original work, and this also means that people will more naturally compare the prequel and the original story, and prequels and sequels very rarely surpass the original. All of this is why the Fantastic Beasts series is at its strongest when it's telling the story of Newt Scamander saving magical creatures. This story and its characters are its own, and they aren't dependent on the draw of the original Harry Potter series, and they simultaneously complement the original work by expanding the world through a lens that we really didn't get that much of in either the films or the books. And we know how these two stories are connected. Newt ends up writing a textbook that Harry would read someday. But this story about Newt in the first film isn't compromised in order to make cheap references to the original work. This is also why the Star Wars prequels suffered, for their determination to make reference to and explain things that we saw in the original trilogy, and Crimes of Grindelwald has these frustrating and strange moments like the scene where they return to Hogwarts and it kind of feels forced. And I should discuss here one of the most common criticisms that you will hear of prequels when it comes to dependency on the original work. Narrative tension. A prequel crushes tension right from the get-go. In Star Wars episodes
Main characters who show up later
we know
can't
that
be killed
Anakin,
off,
Yoda,
reducing
Obi-Wan,
the tension
Palpatine,
of the
Anto,
story.
Luke,
Same
Lightsaber,
I just
Main
don't know where they're going.
Okay, this complaint is understandable. Prequels often draw on characters and narrative threads from the original work, meaning that anyone who is remotely familiar with it will never believe that the heroes can be in danger if they appear later on, or that the events of that main story will not come to pass. Ergo, there is no narrative tension because there is no ambiguity about how it will turn out. And though this is a legitimate criticism, one that we should consider when writing prequels, I personally feel that it is often overstated. Let me show you why.
This is a game of chess, which, like any good story, has twists and turns and heroes and villains and plans and betrayals, as the kings fight it out against one another. But let's say that you know how this story will end. You know that the king will be pinned against this wall by this dark rook with the help of these two dark bishops, and that he will look down at the king, the enemy, and he says, "You killed my father, and now this is time for my revenge." And the rook takes his sword and he kills the enemy king. And the empire of Canterbury is wiped out, defeated. But here's the thing, you don't know how this story started. I could tell a story about a lone pawn and his rivalry with an enemy knight, or I could tell a story about star-crossed, battle-worn lovers on the opposite sides, a white pawn and a dark pawn. Or maybe I could tell a story about one of the bishops and their personal crisis of faith that they had beforehand, something we didn't hear about in the original. What I'm trying to get at is that prequel stories don't need to draw on the narrative tension of the original story. They don't need to draw on the tension of where the king dies with the rook and the bishops. Narrative tension usually only becomes a problem in prequel stories when they derive their tension from a plot point that we already know the outcome of. But, admittedly, this is quite often the relationship between the prequel and the original work. In the Star Wars prequels, almost all of the narrative tension is derived from whether or not Anakin will turn to the dark side, which we already know he does. And because we where the story was going, some people felt that there weren't believable stakes in the narrative. The audience already that this white rook will become a dark rook by the end of the story. But this problem is avoidable. The only question is, how?
You can derive tension from unseen story arcs, personal struggles, heartbreak, building and losing relationships, all of which, if written well enough, can be compelling by themselves. You can derive tension from new characters. This is partly why Rogue One succeeded where the prequel series didn't. We had a host of new characters to care about, so there were stakes, we could lose them, even though we knew that the rebels would end up getting the Death Star plans. This is also partly why the first Fantastic Beasts film succeeds as a prequel, where the Crimes of Grindelwald doesn't so much. In the first one, the narrative tension is almost entirely derived from whether or not Newt can save these magical beasts. There are stakes with ambiguity that we can believe in. In the second one, where was the narrative tension? I had to go back in the middle of writing the script to go read a plot synopsis because it was so convoluted that I couldn't remember where most of the narrative tension came from, even though I saw it relatively recently. The first film really doesn't have that much to do with Grindelwald. You can almost take him out and it wouldn't change that much. The Crimes of Grindelwald, on the other hand, it largely derives its tension from three main questions. Number 1, who is Credence's family? Number 2, why can't Dumbledore fight Grindelwald? And number 3, can they stop Grindelwald? The first question is actually fine. It was badly executed in the film, but in theory it works for the story. But like how Anakin will turn to the dark side, we already generally know why Dumbledore won't fight Grindelwald, and we know that he defeats him in 1945. And another reason that I don't particularly like this criticism of narrative tension in prequels is that it assumes that the reader or viewer only cares about the end of the journey, rather than the journey itself, which is what a prequel is usually about. This criticism presupposes that knowing that the villain will survive or that the hero will die is all that matters, rather than how we get to that point. I'm really not sure that this is true. Book readers often go and enjoy stories that they've already read and they know how it turns out. On a meta-literary analysis level, in a lot of stories we know that the hero will survive and eventually the villain will be defeated. We kind of just pretend to not know that for a lot of stories. And if something is popular enough to get a prequel, then it is drawing on an already established audience who know about the story. This isn't an illegitimate criticism, but I think it's a reductionist answer to why prequels suffer. And it certainly doesn't fully encompass the problems with the Star Wars prequels or with Crimes of Grindelwald. Chapter 4. Of Fantasy, of Dreams, and Ceremonies. Really good writers know that there is power in mythology, in imagination, in mystery, in the unknown. Rowling uses it in her description of Dumbledore and Grindelwald's duel in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. They say, still, that no wizarding duel ever matched that between Dumbledore and Grindelwald in 1945. Those who witnessed it have written of the terror and the awe they felt as they watched these two extraordinary wizards do battle. Dumbledore's triumph, and its consequences for the wizarding world, are considered a turning point in magical history. This duel was so spectacular that it cannot be put into words. George Lucas mythologized the past in A New Hope when describing the time before the Empire.
For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, before the Dark Times, before the Empire.
These lines naturally invite the imagination of the reader or viewer to enrich the text with their own thoughts. They don't know how the duel went down, but they know it was spectacular. They don't know how the Jedi fell, but they know it was a dark tragedy. Why does this power of mythology matter for prequels, though? I'll let Casper take us away with some more literary theory. Oh, I didn't see you there. I was just reading Claude Lévi-Strauss's Mythologiques in the original French. Just some light reading. Easy enough. I'm sure you've read it. May I offer you a brandy? No? Chardonnay? No? No? I want to get right down to it. Well, it's kind of you to have joined me this evening. In the 1967 essay by Roland Barthes, Death of the Author, he writes about the value of mythology. There is one place where this multiplicity is collected, not the author, but the reader. The reader is the very space in which are inscribed, without any being lost, all the citations that a text consists of. The unity of a text is not in its origin, but in its destination. Clear enough, of course. I'm sorry? Oh, you didn't understand it. Well, to put it into simpler words, simple English, it is the imagination of the reader that not just interprets the text, but enriches the text. Death of the Author theory recognizes that the reader engaging with these mythological moments is important in the experience of the text itself. But that is all from me. I'm afraid I have duties to attend to. And it's these mythologized moments that are precisely the type of story that prequels are made out of, evidently given Star Wars and the Crimes of Grindelwald. And this is the third problem that prequels face. Prequels necessarily demystify these moments that made the original story more involving. And this is hard to do well, because as Lucas and Rowling both clearly understood, sometimes wonder, awe, and imagination enrich the text better than detailing exactly what happened ever might. Instead of strengthening both stories, it weakens both of them. Epilogue. It's not the endings that will haunt you, but the space where they should lie. The things that simply faded without one final wave goodbye. There are some good prequels. I think Bumblebee is perhaps the best example, but interestingly enough, it is being written specifically to distance itself from the original work. The Transformers series by Michael Bay, the orgy of metal and explosions. In fact, it's so different and disconnected to it that it could be more arguably called a reboot than a prequel. But for all these reasons, prequels are hard to do well. When writers sit down to piece together a prequel to their story, they usually imagine its relationship to be mutualistic, that the prequel will make the original story richer by detailing things that we never knew much about, and also that by knowing the original story, the prequel will be a more involving experience. But for the reasons we have discussed, this relationship often ends up being not mutualistic, but parasitic instead. They can undermine one's experience of the original work by dictating how you should read it and throwing away interpretations that help people connect with the text. They can demythologize parts of the story when imagination often enriches the text better than detailing what exactly happened ever might. Instead of complementing the original story, prequels can become dependent on references to it. Instead of crafting moments that have their own innate power, they are just nodding to existing fans and relying on their attachment to it, sort of hiding behind it. This difficult relationship between prequels and their original work means that if done badly, they can suck life from things that we love and become monstrous chimeras so shackled to the original work that its ankles are still bleeding. And if you didn't understand this video, then maybe you need a prequel to see how we got to this point. Or maybe that'll just make this video worse. Hard to say.